One Piece chapter 1043 has sent the fan base into an absolute frenzy. I'm pretty sure in these past few days there's been about 95 theories per hour, and that's because we recently got two massive reveals, not only with Luffy being Joy Boy, but also him awakening his Devil Fruit. And in this video, we're gonna be going through all the major theories on what Luffy's real Devil Fruit abilities could be. Is it a mythical Zoan like Wukong or Hanuman, or is it maybe something like Oil, or the one that I personally believe in the most, which is Resin? I'm gonna break everything down and explain my thoughts, but first off, if you are not already, make sure you subscribe and join our King Pirates crew. Also, if you have a good time watching this video, please drop a like for the YouTube algorithm. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Alright, but to start things off, the first thing I actually want to do is establish some ground rules, because with these crazy reveals, people are just going all over the place and getting kind of carried away at what the actual question is, which is what exactly is Luffy's Devil Fruit awakening going to be. So I want to establish some boxes that we have to check off for each theory, and the first one is simply that it has to make sense with Luffy's abilities that we've seen so far. And so far in the story, it has clearly resembled rubber. His body expands and stretches just like rubber from the inside out. He's immune to blunt attacks because of it. So whatever Luffy's real Devil Fruit is, it has to make sense with everything we've seen from Luffy so far. And that gets us to the second box that we also have to check off, which is that the ability has to explain why Luffy was immune to lightning from Enel. Because as we saw during Skypiea, Enel's lightning did absolutely nothing on Luffy, and at the time it absolutely made sense because we thought he was rubber. But now that he's actually no longer rubber, whatever this new ability is, it has to explain why he was able to tank the lightning. After that, the next checkbox has to do with Luffy's physical appearance, specifically how he looked at the end of 1043 when he was awakening his Devil Fruit and his hair was turning into this gooey, liquidy substance. And then finally, the last box that the theory has to check for me is that the awakening ability of the Devil Fruit has to be absolutely terrifying. And that's because we found out about Luffy's Devil Fruit from the Gorosei, who were absolutely terrified. It was so damn scary that just based off of some rumors, they immediately sent the CP0 to his death to take out Luffy. So whatever this new Devil Fruit is, its awakening abilities has to have the Gorosei shaking in their boots. But other than that, those are the main boxes that I think each theory has to check in order for it to make sense. So without further ado, let's actually talk about some of these theories, with the first one being Wukong. Now this one I'm actually pretty familiar with, because first off, Wukong being connected to Luffy, that's something that the community has discussed for a while. The similarities between them are very clear, so even before this whole Devil Fruit thing happened, there was discussion about those two. But the other reason I'm very familiar with this theory is that I know Wukong very well. You see, Wukong is an insanely popular Chinese mythological character, and having grown up in China for the first 8 years of my life, I actually know Wukong pretty well. There was a very popular TV show depicting the story Wukong is from, The Journey to the West, and I watched that show a lot growing up, so I know Wukong's story very well, which is why when I first heard this theory, the connections were very clear off the bat. Wukong's personality reminds me of Luffy right away. He's very goofy and devious. Also, there's the fact that he's the monkey god, and Luffy's last name is literally Monkey. And if you do a deeper dive on Wukong's story like O'Hara recently did, you'll find even more connections, not only to Luffy's character, but also his story. So clearly there's a lot of connections between Wukong and Luffy, but this is where I want to kind of rein things back and make sure we focus on the boxes and what we're actually talking about. Because although Wukong has a lot of connections to Luffy's character, when it comes to the Devil Fruit, there's really not that much there. If anything, there's really only a few loose connections, like Luffy's ability to stretch could be connected to the staff of Wukong, which expands. But first off, it's not really even connected to Wukong himself, it's his weapon. And second of all, it only specifically focuses on how Luffy stretches and not any of the other rubber qualities that he has. Like for example, Luffy can also inflate himself, he's also immune to blunt attacks, and those have nothing to do with Wukong. Another point that gets brought up in this theory is Luffy's ability to fly in Gear 4th could be connected to the cloud that allows Wukong to fly. But once again, it's not even a direct connection to Wukong himself, but instead just his vehicle. And on top of that, it's only connecting to such a specific element of Luffy's power. Besides that though, the only other thing that I've seen is Wukong's ability to use fire. Now I'm not exactly sure how he uses fire in the original story, but if I remember correctly from the show, he used to breathe out fire. So in a way, I guess you could connect that to Luffy's fire attacks, but once again, this is incredibly specific as Luffy literally only has 2 fire attacks. So overall, to me, this theory is actually incredibly weak because there's nothing really actually connecting Wukong to Luffy's abilities that we've seen so far. Of course, if you want to argue that Luffy draws inspiration from Wukong, there's no one that's gonna argue against that, but at the same time, Wukong is an insanely popular character that a lot of other shonen characters have drawn inspiration from. Like Goku, for example, is pretty much a one-to-one copy copy of Sun Wukong before he turned Super Saiyan. And even within One Piece, there's another character that draws a ton of inspiration from Wukong, and that is Nami. She literally has the Climattack, which is an extendable staff just like Wukong, and now recently after she got Zeus, she has her Nimbus Cloud as well. So to me, Sun Wukong is just a character inspiration for Luffy and really has nothing to do with his devil fruits, because when we look at the boxes that we set up earlier, the only one that it really checks is that it could be a terrifying ability, because it would be a mythical zone of an actual god, so it could have some terrifying abilities, but it just doesn't check any of the other boxes. It has nothing to do with rubber, it doesn't explain why Luffy was immune to Enel, and it doesn't look anything like what we saw at the end of 1043. So with that said, let's move on to our next theory, another mythical zone, and that is Hanuman. Now this theory I'm sure probably was discussed before, but it's really been popping up recently. The two videos I saw on this were from my guy Evil and also Brago. I'll link all the videos in the description, so make sure you go check them out. But as far as this theory goes, I actually think it's very similar to the Wukong one, but it does have a lot more legs to it. To give you guys a breakdown, Hanuman is actually a Hindu god. It's a divine Vanara, which is actually just a monkey. Now right off the bat, we already have a connection with Hanuman being a monkey and Luffy's last name being Monkey. So in that regard, it's very similar to Sun Wukong, and also just like Sun Wukong, when you do a deeper dive on Hanuman, you will find a lot of similarities and connections between Hanuman and Luffy. For example, Zunisha's inspiration is Ganesha, another Hindu god that is connected to Hanuman, and that's just one of many similarities you will see between Hanuman and Luffy. But once again, I don't want to dive too deeply into those other connections, and instead, first off, focus on the main things that we have to check off. And I think this is especially important with this theory because Hanuman is literally a religious figure, which means there's an insane amount of lore about them, so if you dive deep enough, you could probably find connections to anybody you want. Also, there's the fact that Hanuman was likely the inspiration for Sun Wukong, so a lot of the same similarities you're gonna find with Wukong, you probably find with Hanuman. So instead of diving into all of these little obscure connections, I want to focus on how it relates to Luffy's power. And I will say, unlike Wukong, Hanuman actually makes some sense. First off, Hanuman is known to be a shapeshifter that could change its size to big or small, and while that's not exactly rubber, it does kind of loosely connect it, especially with Luffy's combat style, because if you look at all of Luffy's attacks, they're kind of just inspired by other things. A lot of Luffy's early attacks are literally just based off of weapons like pistol or even a balloon, and even as things advance, Luffy just drew inspiration from other people. Gear 2nd, for example, was him trying to copy Soru, Gear 3rd was him trying to imitate a giant, and even with something like Gear 4th, you see aspects of other people like Bellamy. So while shapeshifting is not exactly like rubber, it does connect to Luffy's combat style enough that I will count it as evidence. After that, we have the question of how Luffy was immune to Enel, and well, Hanuman is actually immune to fire and lightning. So not only does that solve the Enel question, but it could also explain how Luffy uses Red Hawk and Red Rock. So that's another box checked off, and I also think the third box could get checked as well, because although Hanuman looks like a monkey, him shape-shifting could turn him into this goo-like appearance. So I feel like that box could be technically checked off as well. And then finally, the last box would get checked as well because it's a mythical zone of a god. On top of that, there are some interesting bonus points that Evil brought up in his video, which is that Hanuman is known to be not only a glutton, but also a celibate, both of which Luffy are that we kind of just accepted up until now as part of his character. But it would be an interesting twist if the devil fruit actually did that to him. So with this theory, Hanuman actually checks all the boxes, making it a real possibility, but I do still have my reservations about it. First off, as far as shapeshifting goes, although it does connect to Luffy's abilities, it still doesn't explain everything, like why Luffy's immune only to blunt attacks. Like if you want to say shapeshifting is allowing Luffy to kind of absorb those attacks just like a Logia would, I think the same thing should also apply to sharp attacks. So as far as the first box goes and how it relates to rubber, I'm definitely still a little iffy on it. But second of all, I think the biggest thing that's holding me back for this theory is that Hanuman is literally a god. Like we're talking about a being that is supposedly 2.49 million years old, which means there's been so much lore and religious text developed about him. So I feel like with a being like that, it's going to be way easier to just find the things that support your argument and just overlook everything else. Like for example, Hanuman's immunity to fire and lightning that supports the Enel argument. That explanation certainly works, but it also overlooks the fact that Hanuman is pretty much immune to all elements. He's immune to lightning and fire, but he's also immune to wind and water, which Luffy certainly is not. So once again, that's another box that feels like it's kind of nitpicked. So all in all, while I do think this theory is a possibility, I feel like a lot more of these connections are just coincidences, and I think Hanuman is more so just the inspiration to Luffy's character as opposed to this mythical zone. And that gets us to our final theory, and this is the one that I believe in the most, and that is the resin fruit. Now this is a theory that multiple people have discussed. I think Uteron might have been the first one to talk about it, although after reacting to a bit of his video yesterday on stream, I think he pushes the narrative of oil a little more, and he brought up a bunch of arguments and how the Japanese language translates and all of these double entendres. But personally for me, oil just completely misses the first box and doesn't really have anything to do with Luffy's abilities that we've seen. Resin, on the other hand, not only checks every single box, but actually has bonus boxes checked that actually makes a lot of sense. And this theory was really summed up perfectly in this graphic by Reddit user Pringles. First off, they go on to explain why it makes sense with Luffy's abilities. It has rubber-like qualities like an amber state that allows it to be stretchy. It also becomes soft on heating and burns with a smoky flame, not only lining up with Gear Second's appearance, but also applies to his fire abilities. They also talk about how it could be hardened, but I think hardening is just Luffy's hockey. But the final point that they make is really important, which is that resin is an insulator, which means that electricity does not flow freely within it, which would explain the Enel situation. So right off the bat, just with that, resin already checks 3 boxes for me. It can act in the same way as rubber, explaining Luffy's abilities. It's also an insulator, which explains the Enel situation. And then finally, the last panel that we saw of Luffy's hair looks like resin. So it already checks 3 boxes, and the 4th box I'm gonna talk about in a little bit, because first I want to talk about some bonus boxes that it checks that are really good. The first one that gets brought up is Oda's 2 favorite scenes. His favorite scene is the campfire scene in Skypiea, which is not only iconic, but also has the image of Luffy where he looks like the sun god Nika. So that could be one way it relates back to the devil fruit if the devil fruit belonged to Joy Boy, who is Nika. But more importantly, we have to talk about Oda's second favorite scene, which is this iconic scene where Robin wipes this sticky goo onto Usopp's pants. It's an absolutely hilarious scene, and you can see why Oda would love it just from the scene alone. But when we go back and read that chapter again, it turns out that sticky goo is actually resin. That feels like a pretty big coincidence that could just be a massive hint. Now again, this is just a bonus connection. It could be just a coincidence. And there's a few other bonus points that get made that aren't as strong. For example, Pringles talks about how Luffy could be using resin and melting it to change directions during Snake Man. So that would explain the specific line of dialogue from Kaido where he says rubber can't do that. And they also try to make this connection with the Sun Tree Eve and Nika, but that point I feel like was kind of weak. But then there's this final bonus box that this theory checks, which I think brings everything together. And that is the chapter number, which is 1043 or 1043. And coincidentally, in Japanese, 1043 translates to Jushi-san or me, which literally translates to resin fruit or Mr. Resin. The writing is on the wall, people. It's literally in the chapter number. We pretty much see at the end of the chapter Luffy's hair turning into resin, and this theory just checks every single box, which gets us to the last box that it needs to check, which is that it has to be a terrifying ability that the Gorosei are scared about. Now I will say this one I had the hardest time figuring out, and it's probably the weakest argument. At first I couldn't really think of why the Gorosei would be so scared, but after thinking about it for a while, the possibilities of this awakening are really endless. Unlike before, Luffy's no longer just a rubber man with his own body. Now he can probably actually produce a vast amount of resin that's a much more flexible rubber. So in a sense, his abilities have become much closer to Doflamingo and Katakuri, where he's not just made of it, he can actually produce it. And if he's actually awakened, it means he could change his surroundings to his liking. As I mentioned earlier, Luffy this whole time, his combat style has been recreating things and imitating and learning from people. Well, now instead of trying to recreate something with rubber, he can actually mold it and create it with resin. He could probably make actual weapons now. He could probably create even more versions of himself like Doflamingo and Cracker did. Essentially, the environment has just become a giant Play-Doh for him to turn into anything. And now he has a lot more flexibility. He can have it in liquid form as resin. Of course, he's definitely still going to be able to use it like rubber, and he can also harden it with hockey. His own attacks can now not only get much more creative, but much more massive and devastating. Like, think about how strong Doflamingo's birdcage was, or how much of an upper hand Katakuri had just because he could produce more mochi. Luffy can do all of that now and just absolutely dominate the battlefield. And on top of that, with the fruit most likely being Joy Boy's fruit, the Gorosei have absolutely every right to be goddamn terrified. And in my hand, I have a One Piece volume between 75 and 80. If you guess it wrong, you have to like, subscribe, and watch the next video. And the answer is 78.